Now in this video, we're going to dive into some nitty-gritty about preparing for your short-term mission trip experience. I'm going to give you the top 10 things that you must do before you go on a short-term mission trip. If you don't do these 10 things, you might still have a great mission trip experience, but quite frankly, you might not. These are the 10 things you must do to ensure that you maximize your mission trip experience and you maximize your opportunity to proclaim the glory of God on your short-term mission trip. All right, here we go. Number 1. Pray. I know that sounds simple, but it is essential. Pray, 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 pray. Now, if you forget the other 9 things on this list and you do this one, things will probably be okay because we trust the God of the universe, the creator of everything, is sovereign and he has the ability to orchestrate all things. In fact, he promises that he will. I want to encourage you to ask God to intervene for your team and your mission trip experience. You should pray for things like team unity. Because when you're on a mission trip, living in close quarters, sometimes things can get a little bit hostile or a little bit, annoying. So you want to pray for team unity. You want to pray for team health. Pray that your team stays healthy physically. Pray for your team's spiritual strength, that your team could be able to do the mission that is set forth for them. You want to pray for things like logistics to go well. When you're planning a short-term trip, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So pray for the logistics. Pray for your leaders, that they would have wisdom to know how to lead your team effectively. Pray for the people you're going to be sitting next to on an airplane, that the Lord would give you an opportunity to share the gospel with them. Pray for the people you're going to talk to on the mission field. God knows who you're going to talk to. God knows who you're going to have correspondence with. Pray that God will give you an opportunity to share the gospel in an effective way. Pray now that God would soften the hearts of the people that you are going to talk to, because God can do a great work. So by the time you get there and you share the gospel, they are ready to hear. They are ready to listen, and they are ready to respond to the power of God. Please, I implore you, pray for your trip, pray for your team, pray for yourself, and pray that God would use this short-term mission trip experience ultimately for His glory. The second thing you ought to do as you're preparing for your short-term mission trip is study the culture of the place you're going to. Now, again, that may seem obvious, but I'm always amazed at how many people go on a short-term trip without really studying the place they're actually going to. You ought to do as much as you can to read everything you get your hands on, to learn about the people you're going to be ministering to on your short-term trip. You should be asking yourself this: what is a day in the life like of the people I'm going to? Now, again, I know that within any country that may vary. For example, for those of us who live in the United States, if you ask yourself, what's it like to live a day in the life of someone who lives in the United States? The answer might be, well, it's different depending on where you live. That is true. However, there are some things that are sort of universal, some things that everyone who lives in this country will wrestle through, will understand. You ought to be asking yourself that same question about whatever nation or people you're going to. Ask yourself, what is a day in the life like for them? You also should be asking yourself things like, what are the politics of that place? What are some of the historical trends? What are some of the cultural norms? You really ought to be asking yourself on a regular basis, what is going on in that part of the world, or what's going on in the minds of the people who live there that I should know about, so that as I have conversations with them, I can be able to better minister to them. Ultimately, if you're not able to engage with people, and if you don't understand their culture, you're going to have a really tough time communicating the gospel. It's essential that you understand the philosophies and ideologies of people living in that place. For example, as you travel through Eastern Europe, you'll recognize that there are lots of people in an older generation that sometimes don't necessarily have ambition to make their own lives better. In fact, they frequently will speak against anyone who tries to inspire them to do better for themselves. Well, you ask yourself, why is that the case? Well, you realize that the eastern part of Europe, particularly the places that were a part of the Soviet Union, were dominated by communism for the better part of the 20th century. And that has influenced how many people think. Because communism was so prevalent in Eastern Europe, you have a large segment of the population that have certain ideologies and certain philosophies. Well, if you go in there, you don't understand that, and you try to preach the gospel to those people, quite frankly, you'll probably end up getting rejected or ignored, or maybe even treated in a hostile way. But if you can understand the ideology and the philosophy of the people there and how communism impacted that region of the world, you'll be able to have a conversation that's much more engaging, and you'll be much more likely to be listened to as you're preaching the gospel. It is essential that you do cultural study of the people you're going to. Now, if people deal with something you don't deal with, it doesn't make them wrong or bad. It just means they've been impacted by something. It doesn't mean that they are dumber than you or they don't know as much as you. Quite frankly, it's rarely the case. It just means that there's been something that happened in their history, in their region, that will impact whether or not they will be willing to listen to you. And if you're not willing to understand that and engage with them on their terms, well, they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to want to listen to what you have to say, and they're certainly not going to respond to the gospel that you're preaching to them. It is essential that we understand the culture we are going to if we're going to be effective on a short-term mission trip experience. In addition to that, one other caveat you want to think about is you want to ask yourself, what are some of the cultural do's and don'ts as you travel around the world? For example, if you're in some places in Southeast Asia, you would never want to put your feet on anything. I remember I made a big mistake. I was in an airport and I stood up on a chair to get the team's attention. And instantly a young man ran up to me and started yelling at me, telling me how I had offended him because I had put my feet on a chair. That was a big no-no in this particular Asian country. I was an ignorant American walking into an Asian culture that I didn't understand. And I now had offended a young man who now was angry with me and was no longer willing to listen to me. I had lost credibility with him. I had lost opportunity to influence him for the gospel because of my own cultural ignorance. I would challenge all of us, encourage every single person to do extensive cultural study of the nation or the region you're going to. Understand the people you're going to. Understand what will offend them and what doesn't. Understand what will motivate them and what doesn't. Understand what are the cultural do's and don'ts of that particular people group. And make sure you keep that in mind as you look to go to that particular people group. Do extensive cultural study and historical understandings as you head into a particular region. That'll guarantee that you'll be much more effective as you engage with people. The third thing you want to be doing as you prepare for your short-term mission trip experience is making sure you understand how to share the gospel effectively and how to do it contextually in that culture. Now, in a future video, we're going to talk extensively about how to share the gospel. We'll train you exactly on how to share the truth in Scripture that the God of the universe has made a way for us to be rescued. It's your job, though, to make sure that you've done enough cultural study and that you have prepared to share the gospel in that culture. Specifically, what you want to be doing is looking for illustrations that would make sense to those people so that you can share the gospel in a way that they can understand. You want to be looking for things that will make sense to them that otherwise may not make sense to you. In every culture you go to around the world, there are things that will inspire them, and there are things that, quite frankly, are offensive. You want to make sure that you have prepared to share the gospel in a way that is contextual. You cannot assume that sharing the gospel in the way you do in the United States will be as effective when you do it overseas. Now, that doesn't mean the gospel changes. I've had people say that. Well, are you saying that the gospel changes depending on what country you're in? Of course not. The gospel does not change. The truth that Jesus Christ died for our sins and rose from the dead does not change, and it transcends culture. However, there is a really important idea that comes in. We must understand that there are certain things I can say in some cultures that will help people understand it better that I can't say in others. There are certain things I can say in some cultures that will help people understand the gospel and it will resonate with them. And I can't say those exact same things as I can in other cultures. Or maybe I can say it differently. Quite frankly, even within the United States, that's the case. For example, if I'm traveling through the state of Alabama and I'm dealing with people who are from the South, I probably want to be a little bit more, let's say, nice. I want to be a little more cordial. I want to be a little friendlier because that's how people in Alabama function. Now, if you're from, let's say, the city of Philadelphia, where I was born and raised, people don't trust you if you're as nice. If you're in New York or Boston or some other place in New England, the reality is people are going to be a little bit more, let's say, standoffish. They're not going to be as friendly. And if you walk into that culture trying to be super friendly, the reality is you may end up losing respect or credibility. You have to go in and understand how people want to be talked to. Don't assume that people want to be talked to the way you want to talk to them. It's not appropriate for you to talk to people the way you think is best. It is most appropriate for you to share the gospel in a way that will resonate with them. So before you go, think through what is the culture of the people I'm going to. How can I share the gospel in a way that is contextualized so the people who are listening are more likely to respond to it? Ultimately, that's our goal. We want people to respond to the gospel. I once heard a pastor say this: the gospel in and of itself is offensive. The reality is we're going to offend people when we share the gospel. Let's make sure we don't offend them in the way we share the gospel. The fourth thing you want to be doing as you prepare for your short-term mission trip experience is making sure that you're ready to share your own personal story, or what some Christians would call your own personal testimony. This is really, really important. One of the most awesome ways that God can use you is through your own personal story. So you want to make sure you're really prepared to do that. Sometimes I encourage people to actually write it out. So if you're someone that you think that would be helpful for you, go ahead and just actually write out your whole personal story. Or maybe you find a friend or a family member that you can sit down with and just say, hey, I want to practice sharing my story with you. And really think through what you want to say and how you would share what God has done in your own life. Again, this is a very effective way to share the gospel. The reality is that people can try to argue with you in a variety of different ways about a variety of different things. But no one can argue with you about your own personal story. No one can tell you that you're wrong in what you've experienced. If the power of God has transformed you, we would encourage you to be prepared to tell people about how the power of God has transformed you and how the power of God can transform them as well. It's really important that you've well prepared for this. The first time you share your testimony should not be when you are overseas on the mission field talking to someone who lives in that country. The hope would be that you've already thought through it, you've already practiced it, you've already shared it. So that when that time comes and you're in that moment, you can deliver the truth of what God has done in you effectively. Now, this is so important that we're actually going to take time to talk more about this. In a future video, we're going to talk extensively about how to share your own personal story so that you're ready to proclaim the goodness and power of God and what He's done in your life.